The poor woman accidentally hugged a stranger at the airport, not knowing that he was a millionaire. She wanted to forget this moment, but he decided that their meeting was not accidental. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The airport was a sea of people, a constant rush of movement and voices blending into an overwhelming hum. Announcements echoed through the terminal, calling for passengers, listing flight delays, and urging last-minute boarders to hurry. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow on the polished tile floors, reflecting the hurried steps of countless travelers. Aisha weaved through the crowd with determination, dodging rolling suitcases and distracted passengers glued to their phones. Her heart pounded, not from nerves, but from urgency. Her best friend, Mia, was arriving after a year of studying abroad, and Aisha had promised to meet her at the gate. She had barely made it in time, thanks to her shift at the café running long. She glanced up at the large digital screen displaying flight arrivals. Mia's plane had landed 20 minutes ago. Aisha scanned the crowd, stretching onto her toes to get a better view. The terminal was packed, people embracing loved ones, exchanging hurried goodbyes, or standing in clusters, waiting for their turn at baggage claim. Her eyes darted across the sea of faces, searching for Mia's familiar curls. Instead, her gaze locked onto a tall figure in a charcoal gray suit, standing a short distance away near one of the large glass windows. He was turned slightly to the side, his dark brown hair neatly styled, his posture straight and confident. From behind, with his broad shoulders and the way he stood, he looked just like Mia's older brother, Jordan. Relief flooded through her. Jordan had mentioned he might pick Mia up if he finished work in time, but she hadn't expected him to get here so quickly. Without thinking, without second-guessing herself, Aisha pushed forward through the throng of people. She reached him before she had time to reconsider, her arms wrapping around him in a tight, familiar embrace. "Oh my God, I missed you so much," she blurted, her voice muffled against his chest. Except something was off. His body was tense, rigid in a way that didn't match the warmth she expected. His suit smelled different too, a rich, woody cologne instead of Jordan's usual fresh citrus scent. The fabric beneath her fingertips felt unfamiliar, high quality, luxurious in a way she wasn't accustomed to. A shiver of realization crept up her spine. She had made a mistake. Aisha pulled back abruptly, her breath catching as she tilted her head up. The man staring down at her was most definitely not Jordan. He was a stranger, a painfully handsome stranger. His features were sharp, symmetrical, as if sculpted with careful precision. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, a perfectly straight nose. But what struck her most were his eyes. Cold, piercing gray, stormy and unreadable. They locked onto her with a mix of surprise and something else she couldn't quite place. The silence between them stretched, heavy and charged. Heat rushed to her face. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she stammered, taking a step back so quickly she nearly tripped over her own feet. The man's expression remained unreadable, but his brow arched ever so slightly. "Well," he said, his voice deep and smooth, "that was unexpected." Aisha's mortification deepened. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and be swallowed whole. How could she have made such a ridiculous mistake? She waved her hands frantically, as if that could erase the past 10 seconds. "I thought you were someone else. I swear, I didn't mean to—" The corners of his mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. Clearly. His calm, unaffected demeanor only made her embarrassment worse. It was the angle. The reflection in the glass. I only saw your back." and I was emotional, which I guess makes me emotionally nearsighted or something. The words tumbled out faster than she could stop them. That barely there smirk deepened. Emotional nearsightedness? Aisha groaned internally. Why was she still talking? Yes. When emotions override common sense, you see what you want to see instead of what's actually there, she blurted, then immediately cursed herself for continuing to explain. A flash of amusement flickered across his face, but before he could respond, a large, suited man, who looked suspiciously like security, stepped up beside him. "Mr. Grayson, is everything all right?" Aisha froze. Grayson? The name sent alarm bells ringing in her head. She had heard it before. Michael Grayson. Her stomach dropped. Michael Grayson was not just a businessman. He was one of the most powerful financial moguls in the country, a billionaire whose name was spoken in hushed tones across corporate boardrooms. He rarely appeared in public, preferring to operate behind the scenes, and he despised unnecessary attention. And she had just thrown herself at him. Aisha inhaled sharply, her pulse pounding. Oh no. Michael seemed to notice the wave of realization wash over her, because that smirk made a brief, arrogant appearance before he spoke. "You look nervous," he observed, crossing his arms. Aisha blinked rapidly. I'm afraid of embarrassing mistakes being caught on security cameras and ending up on the internet." His gaze flickered to the security guard before returning to her. Understandable? Oh no. Was there already footage of this? She glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of every passing traveler. No one seemed to be paying them any mind. But what if someone had been filming? What if this ended up online? "I need to find my friend," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to leave, but she could feel his eyes on her as she walked away, her skin prickling under his gaze. And somehow she knew he wasn't just going to let her disappear into the crowd. Hours later, Aisha was back at work, standing behind the counter at the airport café. She had managed to push the embarrassing incident with Michael Grayson to the back of her mind, mostly. But the moment the bell above the door chimed and she instinctively glanced up, her breath caught in her throat. Michael Grayson had just walked in. He spotted her instantly, his gaze locking onto hers with sharp precision. She blinked. No, 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 no. This cannot be happening. She straightened her apron, bracing herself. Michael strolled through the cafe, his steps unhurried, exuding the kind of confidence that came naturally to men like him. He reached the counter, leaned slightly forward, and said, "A coffee, but I want it made by you." Aisha narrowed her eyes. He did not just do that. She wanted to ignore him. She should ignore him. But instead, she grabbed a notepad and sighed. This was going to be a problem. Aisha tightened her grip on the notepad, willing her face to remain neutral as Michael Grayson stood on the other side of the counter, exuding the same calm confidence as he had in the airport. His storm-gray eyes never left her face, a hint of amusement flickering in them. A billionaire ordering coffee at an airport cafe wasn't exactly an everyday occurrence, especially not when that billionaire had just been the accidental recipient of the most humiliating hug of her life. She cleared her throat. "What kind of coffee?" Michael's lips quirked slightly, as if he were indulging her by pretending this was an ordinary interaction. "Black." Of course. No sugar, no cream, straight to the point, just like him. Without another word, Aisha turned to prepare his order, hoping, praying, that this would be the end of whatever strange game he was playing. She was certain that men like Michael Grayson didn't frequent places like this, and he had no real reason to be here. Except, as she worked, she could feel his gaze lingering on her. She had dealt with entitled customers before. businessmen who thought their wealth made them superior, travelers who treated service workers as invisible. But Michael Grayson wasn't quite like them. He wasn't rude, he wasn't impatient. If anything, he seemed far too at ease, as if he belonged here, as if he had chosen to be here, watching her with an interest that made her uneasy. Aisha placed the cup in front of him. "Here you go." Michael lifted the coffee to his lips and took a slow sip. Then, without taking his eyes off her, he murmured, "Now, this is much better than an unexpected hug." Heat shot up her spine. So he was enjoying this? Aisha narrowed her eyes. "Are you always this charming, or is this a special effort just for me?" Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he rested one hand on the counter and studied her as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. "I make an effort when I find something intriguing," he said smoothly. Aisha bristled. The way he said it wasn't flirtatious, but there was something about his tone, something calculated, as if he were testing the waters, trying to see how she would react. She exhaled through her nose, determined to keep this interaction as professional as possible. "Well, I hope you enjoy your coffee, Mr. Grayson." She turned away, ignoring the way her skin still prickled under his gaze. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. For the next few days, Aisha tried to shake the feeling of that encounter. She told herself it was nothing, a passing moment of curiosity from a man who would forget all about her the second he returned to his world of power and privilege. Except Michael Grayson kept coming back. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he had meetings nearby. Maybe the coffee was better than she gave it credit for. But when he showed up 3 days in a row, always at the same time, always choosing the same seat, always watching her with that same quiet intensity, she knew it wasn't an accident. She did her best to ignore him. She took orders from other customers, wiped down counters, restocked the sugar and stirrers, all while not looking at the billionaire who had, for some inexplicable reason, decided to turn her café into his personal retreat. But ignoring Michael Grayson was like trying to ignore a storm brewing on the horizon. Inevitably, it would demand attention. On the 4th day, when she set his coffee down in front of him without so much as a glance, he finally spoke. "You're avoiding me." Aisha nearly rolled her eyes. Instead, she plastered on her most professional smile. "I have a job to do, Mr. Grayson." Michael tapped his fingers against the table. That's not an answer. She clenched her jaw. Of course, he wasn't the type to let things go. Sighing, she finally met his gaze. "Why are you here?" Michael tilted his head slightly as if considering his answer. "Because I can be." Her irritation flared. "Don't you have some multi-million-dollar deal to negotiate? Some high-profile event to attend? You don't exactly strike me as someone who enjoys sitting in airport cafes." Michael studied her, then, just when she thought he wasn't going to answer, he said, "And you don't strike me as someone who likes being underestimated." Aisha stiffened. The way he said it, so casually, yet with undeniable certainty, made something inside her bristle. He wasn't wrong. She had spent her entire life proving herself, to teachers who assumed she wasn't as capable as her peers, to employers who thought she wouldn't work as hard, to customers who looked at her and expected nothing but compliance. Michael Grayson's words were too sharp, too precise, and she hated that he had noticed. She squared her shoulders. "I'm not." His lips quirked. "Good." Then, without another word, he returned to his coffee as if the conversation had never happened. Aisha exhaled slowly, turning back to her work. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, something about Michael Grayson's presence lingered in her mind. That night, as she walked home, she tried to push the entire encounter to the back of her mind. She had more important things to worry about, like her younger brother, Omar. The medical bills had been piling up faster than she could keep up with. Omar had always been strong, always brushing off her concerns with a smile, but lately he had been getting worse. His doctor had warned that he would need more intensive treatment soon, and Aisha didn't know how she was going to afford it. She had already been picking up extra shifts, stretching herself thin, trying to save every possible dollar, but it wasn't enough. And now, on top of everything else, a billionaire had decided to make her his latest curiosity. Why? What did Michael Grayson even want from her? The next day, he was there again. This time, Aisha didn't pretend not to notice. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and in no mood for whatever game he was playing. As she set his coffee down in front of him, she crossed her arms. "Okay, enough. What do you actually want?" Michael met her gaze without hesitation. "To talk?" Aisha frowned. "About what?" His fingers drummed against the table. "You?" Her stomach flipped, though whether it was from irritation or something else, she wasn't sure. "Why?" she demanded. Michael leaned back slightly, as if this were the easiest question in the world. "Because you don't treat me like everyone else does." Aisha blinked. That was unexpected. She had been prepared for arrogance, for some kind of smug remark about how she should be flattered that he was paying attention to her. But this? She didn't know what to do with this. Michael tilted his head slightly. "You don't care who I am, or at least you're pretending not to." Aisha inhaled sharply. She was pretending, wasn't she? Because the truth was, Michael Grayson did affect her. She just didn't want to admit it. So instead, she gave him the only response she could think of. "I really don't have time for this." She turned to walk away, but as she did, she could feel his eyes still on her, still watching. And somehow, she knew. This wasn't over. Aisha barely slept that night. Even after she had crawled into bed, exhaustion weighing down on her, her mind refused to quiet. She told herself she didn't care about Michael Grayson's sudden interest in her. She told herself that it didn't matter, that it was just some fleeting amusement for him, the way rich men like to play with things they didn't understand before tossing them aside. But deep down, something gnawed at her, the way he watched her, the way he seemed to notice things others didn't, the way he claimed to enjoy talking to her, not because of what she could offer him, but because she didn't treat him like everyone else did. It didn't make sense, and Aisha hated things that didn't make sense. She woke up groggy, still tangled in the remnants of her restless thoughts. The morning was like any other. She made sure Omar had breakfast, checked his temperature. It was fine, but she still worried, and hurried out the door to work. She was already running on fumes, and her shift had barely begun when the bell above the cafe door chimed. She knew it was him before she even turned around. Michael Grayson walked in with the same composed stride, dressed in a different tailored suit but carrying the same air of effortless authority. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look around. He went straight to his usual table by the window, as if it had always belonged to him. Aisha exhaled slowly. This had to stop. She grabbed her notepad, not that she needed it. She already knew what he was going to order. When she reached his table, he glanced up, amusement flickering in his storm-gray eyes. "You look tired." Aisha clenched her jaw. She wasn't in the mood for this today. "What do you want, Grayson?" His mouth twitched at her use of his last name as if he found it entertaining. "The usual." She scribbled something down on the pad, though she didn't need to, and turned to leave. "Aisha." She froze. He had never said her name before, not once. She turned back to him, wary. "How do you know my name?" Michael didn't blink. "You wear a name tag." Aisha glanced down. Damn it, she had forgotten she was wearing it. "You've been coming here for days, Grayson. It's not that impressive that you finally read it." He tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was a particularly difficult puzzle he was determined to solve. "True, but I wanted to say it." Something about the way he said it sent a strange, unwelcome shiver down her spine. She needed to end this conversation before he pulled her deeper into whatever this was. "Your coffee will be ready soon," she muttered, walking away before he could say anything else. But even as she worked behind the counter, preparing his order, she felt his presence. He wasn't just sitting there, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone or reading the news like most businessmen did. He was watching her, and she hated how aware of it she was. She brought him his coffee without another word, placing it in front of him with a little too much force before turning to leave. "Aisha." She gritted her teeth. He was doing it on purpose now. She turned slowly, crossing her arms. "What, Grayson?" He took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "Why do you work here?" Aisha blinked. "What?" "It's an honest question." "No, it's a condescending question." His expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something behind his gaze. "I don't mean it that way." Aisha inhaled sharply, already regretting engaging in this conversation. "I work here because I have bills to pay. Is that shocking to you?" Michael didn't look shocked. If anything, he looked intrigued. "You're too sharp to be taking orders from impatient travelers all day," Aisha scoffed. "And you're too rich to be drinking airport cafe coffee every morning. But here we are." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Damn it." She turned to walk away again, but his voice stopped her. "I know about your brother." Aisha went completely still. Slowly, she turned back to him, her pulse hammering. "Excuse me?" Michael's gaze didn't waver. "I overheard you talking to a coworker the other day about his medical bills." Heat surged through her, an ugly, defensive heat. "So what?" His fingers tapped against the table once, a measured sound. "Why haven't you asked for help?" Aisha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "From you?" Michael shrugged, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Why not?" She stared at him, unblinking. "Let me explain something to you, Grayson. I don't take money from men like you. I don't take favors, and I don't let people like you pretend to be generous when it costs them nothing." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "People like me." "Yes," she snapped. "People who have everything handed to them. People who think throwing money at a problem makes it go away." Michael exhaled slowly, then leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, "Fair enough." Aisha expected that to be the end of it. It wasn't. Michael picked up his cup, took another sip of coffee, and then, as if it were just a casual afterthought, said, "Then let's make a deal." Aisha narrowed her eyes. "What kind of deal?" He set his cup down. "You cook for me." She blinked. "What?" "For 1 week," he continued, as if he hadn't just said something absolutely insane. 3 meals a day, at my place. Aisha gaped at him. "You're joking." "No." She shook her head, half laughing. "Why the hell would I do that?" Michael met her gaze evenly. "Because I'll pay you more than you make here in a month, and you'll have enough to cover your brother's treatment." Aisha's breath caught. The offer was ridiculous, unbelievable. And yet, Her stomach twisted painfully. Omar, his treatment, the bills stacking up. Michael Grayson was offering her an out. But could she trust him? She wanted to say no. She should say no. But instead, she found herself staring at him, at the quiet confidence in his expression, at the way he wasn't pressuring her, just presenting the choice. And for the first time in a long time, she hesitated. Because despite everything, despite her pride, despite her distrust, she needed the money. And Michael Grayson knew it. Aisha sat on the worn couch in her small apartment that night, staring at the ceiling as the weight of her decision pressed down on her. The offer Michael had made was absurd. Cook for him for a week, 3 meals a day, and in return she'd make more than she earned in a month, more than enough to cover the next round of Omar's medical bills. It should have been an easy decision. But nothing involving Michael Grayson could ever be easy. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust his sudden interest in her, didn't trust his reasons for offering her something so convenient, so perfectly timed. And yet, she wasn't naive enough to believe she could afford to turn him down. Omar's condition wasn't improving. He was putting on a brave face, pretending he felt fine. But she saw the moments when he winced, when he moved too slowly, when the exhaustion settled into his bones like a weight he couldn't shake. He needed better treatment, and that required money, more than she had, more than she could save in time. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. A week. Just a week. The next morning, when she walked into the café, she found Michael already sitting at his usual table, as if he knew she'd come with an answer. She walked over, crossing her arms. Fine. Michael lifted his gaze to hers, a flicker of satisfaction passing through his stormy eyes. You'll cook for me? 1 week, she clarified. That's it. He nodded, unbothered. 1 week. Aisha exhaled, arms tightening around herself. I don't trust you. Michael's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Noted. She narrowed her eyes at him. If you try anything. I won't, he said smoothly. This is a business arrangement. Business arrangement. Right. And why did it feel like something else entirely? She shook off the thought. When do I start? Tonight? She stared at him. Tonight? Michael nodded. I'll send a car to pick you up. Aisha bristled at the implication that she couldn't get there on her own, but she held her tongue. If he wanted to act like a billionaire who had never met someone without a driver before, that was his problem. She turned to leave, but he stopped her with a simple, quiet statement. I'm glad you agreed. Aisha didn't respond. She wasn't sure she was. That evening, she stood outside her apartment, staring at the sleek black car that had pulled up at exactly 7 p.m. The uniformed driver stepped out, nodding politely as he opened the door for her. She hesitated. She hated this. Hated the way it made her feel like she was stepping into another world. But then she thought of Omar, and she climbed inside. The drive was smooth, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows as they moved through streets she rarely visited. The closer they got to Michael's neighborhood, the more the scenery changed. Old apartment buildings replaced by towering glass structures, bustling streets fading into quiet, pristine avenues lined with luxury boutiques and high-end restaurants. By the time they pulled up to his building, Aisha was gripping her bag so tightly that her fingers ached. The doorman greeted her with the kind of politeness that came from years of dealing with wealthy clientele, but there was an underlying curiosity in his gaze. She didn't belong here, and they both knew it. Michael's penthouse was on the top floor. Of course it was. The elevator ride felt endless, a quiet hum filling the space as she tried to steady her nerves. When the doors slid open, She stepped out into a hallway that led to an entrance bigger than her entire living room. And then Michael was there, leaning casually against the doorframe, watching her with unreadable eyes. "Welcome." Aisha exhaled, squaring her shoulders. "Let's get this over with." He pushed off the frame, stepping aside so she could enter. She took one step inside and immediately regretted it. The place was ridiculous. Massive, floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline, the entire penthouse bathed in warm golden light. Everything was sleek, modern, and expensive, from the leather furniture to the marble countertops in the open kitchen. She swallowed hard, refusing to let her awe show. Michael gestured toward the kitchen. "Everything you need is already here." Aisha forced her feet to move, stepping onto floors so polished she was terrified of slipping. The kitchen looked like something out of a high-end cooking show. Stainless steel appliances, an island larger than her entire dining table, shelves stocked with ingredients she had only ever seen in gourmet stores. She turned to him, arms crossing. "You do realize you don't need a personal chef, right? You could just order food." Michael's mouth quirked. "That would be boring." Aisha rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath as she moved to inspect the fridge. At least he hadn't been lying about one thing. Everything she needed was here. Fresh produce, quality meats, spices arranged in perfect rows. Fine. She could do this. She tied her apron around her waist, shaking off the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't here to impress him. She was here to cook, to finish the job, and to walk away with the money she needed. As she moved through the kitchen, preparing the first meal of the night, she could feel Michael watching her. He didn't hover, didn't interfere, but he was there, sitting at the counter, sipping what looked like a glass of whiskey, observing her every move. She tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it didn't affect her, but when she turned around and found him still looking at her with quiet, unwavering focus, something about it made her insides tighten. "What?" she snapped, setting down the knife a little harder than necessary. Michael didn't blink. "I was just wondering." "Wondering what?" "If you always cook like you're at war with the ingredients." Aisha scowled. "This is how I cook." Michael's gaze flickered to her hands. "Your shoulders are tense." She bristled. "You've been watching me for exactly 20 minutes, Grayson. You don't know how I cook." He took a slow sip of his drink. "I know enough." She exhaled sharply, turning back to the stove. "Just let me work." For the rest of the evening, he did. He didn't speak again, didn't interrupt, just sat there, occasionally glancing at his phone, but never truly looking away. When she finally plated the meal and set it in front of him, he took his time picking up the fork, tasting the food with an unreadable expression. Aisha watched, arms crossed. "Well?" Michael took another bite, nodding slightly. Impressive. Something inside her relaxed, not because she cared what he thought, but because at least she wasn't failing. As he finished eating, she began cleaning up, moving through the kitchen with the same practiced efficiency she did at the café. And, for the first time since she had walked into his home, she let herself breathe. One meal down. 6 more days to go. She could handle this. Even if, deep down, she had a feeling this arrangement was going to be far more complicated than she had ever anticipated. Aisha arrived at Michael's penthouse the next morning with her shoulders squared and her resolve firm. She had survived the first evening without incident, and she fully intended to keep things that way. This was a job, nothing more. She would cook, she would get paid, and in a few days she would walk away without looking back. The elevator ride up was quiet, but her thoughts were anything but. Michael Grayson was a complication she hadn't expected. He was arrogant, sharp-eyed, and far too observant for her liking. But beneath all that, there was something else, something unsettling. She had spent the entire night trying to ignore the way he watched her while she worked. It wasn't the usual entitled way rich men looked at service workers. It was something deeper, something like curiosity. And she didn't like it. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped into the penthouse, bracing herself for another long day of cooking under his gaze. She wasn't expecting to find him already in the kitchen. Michael stood at the counter, dressed more casually than usual. No tailored suit today, just dark pants and a fitted button-down with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hair was slightly tousled, like he had run his fingers through it a few times. For a split second, Aisha was caught off guard. He looked different. Less like a billionaire and more like a regular man who had just woken up. She quickly shook off the thought. "You're early," he said, setting down the coffee cup he had been holding. She glanced at the clock on the wall. "You said breakfast at 8. It's 7:58. Michael smirked. "Punctual?" Aisha ignored him, dropping her bag on the counter and rolling up her sleeves. "Any special requests?" He shook his head. "Surprise me." She exhaled sharply. "Of course." As she moved through the kitchen, pulling out ingredients, she tried to pretend he wasn't there. She focused on chopping vegetables, whisking eggs, heating the pan. But no matter how much she concentrated, she could still feel him. Watching. Always watching. Finally, she turned around, irritation flaring. "Do you ever do anything other than stare?" Michael arched a brow, completely unbothered. "I enjoy observing things." "Well, go observe something else." His lips quirked as he took another sip of coffee. "I like watching you cook." Aisha rolled her eyes, turning back to the stove. "You're impossible." Despite her annoyance, she couldn't stop the heat from creeping up her neck. By the time she plated his breakfast, scrambled eggs with herbs, fresh toast, and perfectly crisp bacon, she had convinced herself that she didn't care whether he liked it or not. But then he took a bite. And for the first time since they met, Michael Grayson actually looked surprised. She narrowed her eyes. "What?" He chewed slowly, then set his fork down. "This is good." Aisha crossed her arms. "Did you think I was going to feed you garbage?" Michael's smirk returned, but there was something genuine in his expression now. "I didn't expect it to be this good." She hated that the compliment sent a small jolt of satisfaction through her. "It's just eggs," she muttered, turning back to the sink to start cleaning. "Eggs made by someone who knows what they're doing." Aisha didn't answer. She didn't want to acknowledge the fact that she liked hearing it. For the next few days, their routine continued. She arrived early, cooked 3 meals a day, and did her best to ignore the fact that Michael spent an unreasonable amount of time near the kitchen whenever she was there. At first, she thought he was just trying to amuse himself, playing some kind of game with her. But as the days went on, something shifted. It started with small things. Michael would occasionally roll up his sleeves and help set the table, even though he clearly had never done it before. He would ask questions about the dishes she made, listening intently when she explained techniques and flavors. And then there were the conversations. At first, they were just casual, nothing personal, nothing deep. But then, one evening, as she was cooking dinner, Michael leaned against the counter and asked, "Why did you start cooking?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, flipping the chicken in the pan before answering. "I had to. When my parents died, I had to take care of Omar. Cooking was part of that." Michael was silent for a moment. "I see," he finally said. That was it. No empty platitudes, no awkward apologies, and for some reason that made it easier to keep talking. So she told him about her childhood, about how her mother used to teach her recipes, about how she and Omar had always dreamed of opening a restaurant one day. Michael listened. Really listened. And that was the most dangerous part of all. Because for the first time since she started this ridiculous arrangement, Aisha felt herself softening. And she knew that was a mistake. Because men like Michael Grayson didn't just listen for the sake of listening. They listened because they wanted something. And she had no idea what he wanted from her. The fifth day was when everything changed. It was late, later than usual, when she finished preparing dinner. She had been running behind, distracted by thoughts she didn't want to have, and by the time she set the plate in front of Michael, she was exhausted. But instead of picking up his fork, he did something unexpected. He placed a small box on the counter. Aisha frowned. "What's that?" Michael leaned back in his chair. "A gift." Her heart pounded. "Why?" He tilted his head slightly. "Because I wanted to." Aisha stared at the box like it might explode. She didn't take gifts from men like him, but when she finally opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a chef's knife, sleek, professional, high quality. The kind of knife she had dreamed of owning but could never afford. She swallowed hard, her fingers brushing against the smooth handle. Michael's voice was quieter when he spoke again. "You belong somewhere bigger than an airport cafe, Aisha." Her throat tightened, because for the first time, she didn't hear arrogance in his voice. She heard belief, and that scared her more than anything. She shut the box abruptly, her pulse racing. "I can't accept this." Michael didn't argue. He simply watched her, waiting. She shook her head. "I don't want anything from you, Grayson." Something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable. "Then give it back when the week is over." Aisha gritted her teeth. "Fine." She grabbed her bag and left without another word, the weight of the knife in her hands feeling heavier than it should have. But as she walked away, her chest felt tight. Because no matter how much she wanted to deny it, one thought kept creeping into her mind. What if Michael Grayson wasn't as predictable as she had thought? And what if, against all logic, against all reason, she actually wanted to know him? Aisha barely slept that night. The knife Michael had given her sat on the small table in her apartment, its polished steel reflecting the dim light from the window. She had thought about giving it back immediately, had almost stormed back to his penthouse to throw it at him, but something held her back. It wasn't just the gift itself. It was what it represented. Michael Grayson believed in her, and that terrified her. She had spent her entire life fighting for every opportunity, proving herself over and over again to people who underestimated her. She had never needed validation from a man like him. So why was it that his quiet confidence in her abilities unsettled her more than anything else? She didn't want to think about it. She didn't want to think about him. By the time she arrived at his penthouse the next morning, she had forced herself into a state of indifference. She would finish this week, take her payment, and walk away. Nothing more, nothing less. Michael was already in the kitchen when she arrived, leaning against the counter with a coffee cup in hand. "Morning," he greeted, his voice smooth and even. Aisha ignored the way his sleeves were rolled up again, how his watch gleamed against his wrist, how everything about him seemed so effortlessly composed. She set her bag down. "Do you ever sleep?" His lips quirked. "Do you?" She scowled and turned toward the fridge, determined to ignore the way he always seemed to know how to get under her skin. The rest of the morning passed in relative silence. She cooked. He worked at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing up from his laptop to watch her. It was fine. Normal. Almost routine. Until everything shattered. Aisha had just finished setting up for lunch when her phone vibrated in her pocket. She wiped her hands on a towel before pulling it out, expecting a message from Omar or maybe her coworker at the café. Instead, it was a news notification. Her stomach twisted as she read the headline. Carter Corporation's aggressive acquisitions led to mass evictions in several neighborhoods over the past decade. The name hit her like a brick to the chest. Carter Corporation. Michael's family business. Her blood turned to ice as she scrolled through the article. The name of the company alone wouldn't have meant much to her. She had never cared about the politics of corporate buyouts or the endless greed of the wealthy, until she saw the name of her old neighborhood, the one her parents had lived in, the one they had lost. Her heart pounded as she pieced it together. Years ago, when she was still a teenager, her family had been forced out of their home. The building had been bought, renovated, and resold to people who could afford to live there. It had destroyed her family. Her mother had fought to keep their restaurant alive, but with the loss of their home, the financial strain had been too much. They had lost everything, and now she was standing in the kitchen of the man whose family had done it. The room felt suddenly suffocating, the air too thick, the walls too tight. Michael must have sensed the shift in her demeanor because he finally looked up from his laptop. "Aisha?" Her hands clenched into fists. "You knew," she said, her voice low and shaken with barely restrained fury. Michael frowned slightly, setting his coffee cup down. "Knew what?" Aisha exhaled sharply through her nose, willing herself to stay calm. "Carter Corporation, your family's business. They were responsible for buying out my neighborhood, for forcing my family out of our home." Something flickered across his face, something quick, something almost unreadable. But he didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised. That was the moment the truth settled like a stone in her stomach. "You knew," she repeated, this time with more certainty. Michael exhaled slowly, setting his laptop aside as he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I didn't know about your family specifically." Aisha let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, well, that makes it so much better, doesn't it?" His jaw tightened. "Aisha, listen. I trusted you." She cut him off, her voice rising. "I let you into my life, and this whole time you were part of the reason my family lost everything." Michael's expression was unreadable now, his gaze steady but guarded. "I don't run Carter Corporation. I never have." "But you benefit from it," she snapped. "You live in your perfect penthouse, drinking your expensive whiskey, while people like me scrape by, trying to recover from the mess your family created." Something dark flickered in his eyes. "You think I don't know that?" Aisha froze. Michael ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Do you think I haven't spent my entire life being reminded of what my last name means? Of what my family has done?" She narrowed her eyes. "So what? I'm supposed to feel sorry for you?" His jaw clenched. "No, but I never lied to you." Aisha scoffed. "You didn't tell me either." Michael didn't answer right away, and that silence was enough. Her hands shook as she grabbed her bag, swinging it over her shoulder. "I'm done." Michael stood up. "Aisha, don't." Her voice cracked, but she refused to let the tears fall. I don't want your explanations. I don't want your guilt. I don't want anything from you." For the first time, something like regret flickered across his face. But she didn't care. She turned and walked out of his penthouse, slamming the door behind her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Because if she did, she might have seen the way Michael Grayson stood there, staring at the closed door, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and she might have seen that for the first time in his life. Michael Grayson didn't know how to fix what he had broken. Aisha didn't remember much of the journey home. She barely registered the cold air biting at her skin as she stepped onto the crowded streets, barely noticed the people around her, the honking of taxis, the distant hum of the city that had always been her home. Her mind was too full, full of betrayal, full of anger, full of him, Michael Grayson. She had let her guard down. She had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like the others. That he wasn't just another man born into privilege who thought money could erase the past. But she had been wrong. Because no matter how much he claimed he hadn't known, no matter how much he tried to separate himself from the company his family had built, he had still benefited from it. He had still lived in his perfect penthouse, while her family had lost everything. And she had been naive enough to think he was different. Her hands clenched into fists as she stepped onto the sidewalk in front of her apartment building, her body still trembling from the weight of her emotions. She needed to focus. She needed to forget about him. She needed... Her phone rang. The sharp sound cut through her thoughts like a blade. Frowning, she pulled it from her pocket, her chest tightening when she saw the name on the screen. The hospital. Aisha's breath caught. For a split second, she couldn't move. Then, with trembling fingers, she answered. "Hello?" "Aisha," came the voice on the other end. "A doctor." She recognized the calm professionalism in his tone, but it did nothing to ease the dread pooling in her stomach. "It's Omar." Everything inside her went cold. The hospital was too bright, too sterile. Aisha rushed through the hallways, barely aware of anything except the pounding of her own heartbeat. Her lungs felt tight, her legs unsteady, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. When she reached the nurse's station, she barely managed to get the words out. "My brother, Omar Saleh, where is he?" The nurse looked up, her expression sympathetic. "He's stable, but the doctor needs to speak with you." Stable. Aisha clung to that word, forcing herself to breathe as she followed the nurse down the hall. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions. Had he collapsed? Had his condition worsened? Had she missed the signs? She should have been home. She should have been with him. Instead, she had been in a billionaire's penthouse, letting herself believe in something that was never meant to be. The nurse led her into a small consultation room where a doctor stood by the window, flipping through a chart. He looked up as she entered, offering a small nod. "Miss Saleh." Aisha's throat felt dry. "What happened?" The doctor sighed, closing the file. Omar's condition took a turn this evening. He experienced severe fatigue, dizziness, and chest pains. We ran some tests, and while he's stable now, the results confirm what we feared. Aisha's stomach twisted painfully. "He needs surgery," the doctor continued gently. "Sooner rather than later. Without it, his condition will continue to deteriorate." Aisha swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the chair to keep herself steady. "How much?" she whispered. The doctor hesitated. "The cost is significant, Miss Saleh. Even with insurance, the expenses for the procedure and post-operative care will be high." Aisha didn't need him to say the number out loud. She already knew. It was more than she had, more than she could ever earn in time. Her throat tightened. And if I can't pay? The doctor's silence was all the answer she needed. Her vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. She had done everything right. She had worked, saved, sacrificed, and it still wasn't enough. Her fingers dug into the chair, nails pressing into the worn fabric. She had one option, but she hated it. Aisha didn't remember leaving the hospital. She barely remembered walking back outside, the night air cold against her skin. Her thoughts were a mess. Her pride screamed at her to find another way, to figure it out on her own. But Omar's life wasn't something she could gamble with, and the one person who had the power to change everything was the last person she wanted to see. Michael Grayson. The thought of going back to him after everything made her sick, but she had no choice. Before she could second-guess herself, she pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. She found his number. She had never saved it, but she had memorized it. For a long moment, she just stared at the screen. Then, swallowing her pride, she hit call. He picked up on the second ring. Aisha. His voice was calm, steady, but there was something in it, something different from before. She exhaled sharply, closing her eyes. "Omar needs surgery," she said, forcing the words out before she lost her nerve. There was a brief pause. Then, without hesitation, Michael said, "Where are you?" 20 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up outside the hospital. Michael stepped out, his expression unreadable. His suit was immaculate as always, but there was a tension in his posture, a sharpness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Aisha stood stiffly, arms crossed as he approached. "I can handle this," she said, even though they both knew she couldn't. Michael ignored the statement. "How much?" She hesitated. "A lot." He pulled out his phone. "Give me the details." Aisha clenched her jaw. "I don't want your charity." Michael's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "This isn't charity." "Then what is it?" He exhaled, fingers tightening around his phone. "It's me fixing what should never have been broken." Something inside her twisted painfully, because she knew he wasn't just talking about the money, but she didn't have the strength to fight him right now. So, without another word, she gave him the details. And within minutes, it was done. Just like that. Omar's surgery was paid for. His life was saved, and Aisha had never felt more relieved, or more lost. She swallowed, looking up at Michael. "Why are you doing this?" His jaw tightened. "Because I can." It wasn't an answer, not really, but for now it was enough. She looked away, exhaling slowly. "Thank you." Michael didn't respond right away. Then, softly, he said, "Always." And for the first time since she had learned the truth about his past, since she had walked out of his penthouse, vowing never to look back, Aisha wasn't sure she wanted to walk away anymore. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Aisha sat beside Omar's bed, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. The weight of exhaustion pressed against her, but relief coursed through her veins like a lifeline. Omar was going to be okay. The surgery had gone smoothly. The doctors were optimistic about his recovery. The dark cloud of uncertainty that had hovered over her for months had finally lifted. But even as she exhaled, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying slip from her shoulders, another truth settled deep in her bones. Michael had done this. He had paid for everything without hesitation, without conditions. And that terrified her, because Aisha didn't owe anyone. She had spent her life making sure of that. And now, no matter how much she told herself otherwise, she owed him. Her grip tightened on the coffee cup. She had to return the money, even if it took her years. A soft groan from the bed made her snap out of her thoughts. Omar stirred, his dark lashes fluttering against his cheeks before his eyes slowly opened. She immediately leaned forward. "Hey." His gaze was unfocused at first, but when he looked at her, a weak smile pulled at his lips. "You look terrible." A laugh broke from her before she could stop it, a mix of relief and lingering nerves. "And you look like someone who just had surgery." Omar's smile faded slightly as he looked around the sterile room, confusion flickering across his face. "How did you—" Aisha knew the question before he even finished it. She hesitated, then finally she sighed. "Michael paid for it." Omar's brows lifted. "The billionaire?" She nodded. Omar blinked, still groggy, but clearly surprised. "Wow, what did you have to promise him?" "Your soul?" Aisha scoffed, rolling her eyes. "No, just—" She hesitated. "Nothing." And that was the truth. Michael hadn't asked for anything. He had done it simply because he could. Omar exhaled, shaking his head. "Guess I owe the guy my life." Aisha swallowed. "No, I do." And that was the problem, because she had spent her whole life standing on her own, refusing to let anyone hold power over her. And now, Michael Grayson had stepped into her world and shifted everything she thought she knew about men like him, and she had no idea what to do about it. 2 days later, she found herself standing outside Michael's penthouse. She wasn't sure how she had ended up here. She had told herself she wouldn't come, that she would find another way to repay him, that she didn't need to see him again. But here she was. Heart pounding, she knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Michael stood there, dressed in a dark gray sweater and black pants, his usual composed expression slipping into something unreadable as he took her in. Aisha. Her stomach tightened at the way he said her name. Soft, steady, careful. She forced herself to stand straighter. "Can we talk?" He stepped aside, silently letting her in. The penthouse looked the same as the last time she had been here. Sleek, modern, filled with an emptiness that didn't quite match the man standing in front of her. Michael gestured toward the couch. "Sit." She hesitated, but finally sat down. Michael remained standing for a moment before finally lowering himself into the chair across from her. Silence stretched between them. Then he spoke. "How's Omar?" Aisha exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "Recovering. The doctors say he'll be okay." Michael nodded. "Good." More silence. Aisha hated it. She took a slow breath. "I came to pay you back." Michael's brows lifted slightly. "For the surgery?" She nodded. His gaze flickered with something, amusement, maybe frustration, but he didn't laugh. "You can't afford that." "I will," she said firmly, "even if it takes me years." Michael exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "I didn't do it for repayment." "That's not the point," she snapped. "I don't want to owe you." His gaze locked onto hers. "You don't." Aisha clenched her jaw. "Then why did you do it?" Michael studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because I care." Her breath caught. She wasn't expecting that. She was expecting something logical, something calculated. Not that. Not something so simple and raw. She forced out a weak laugh. "You barely know me." Michael's lips twitched, but his gaze remained serious. "I know enough." Aisha shook her head, standing abruptly. "I don't need this." Michael stood too. "Then why are you here?" She hesitated. She had come to pay him back, to walk away. But now, standing here, facing him, she wasn't so sure. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Michael exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Then stay." She looked up at him. "Why?" He took a step closer. "You've been running since the moment we met, Aisha." His voice was quiet, steady. But you don't have to run from me." Her pulse pounded. She wanted to argue, to push him away, but she didn't. For the first time since this all started, she let herself breathe. Michael's gaze dropped to her lips for a split second before flicking back up to her eyes. Aisha's heart stuttered, and then, before she could talk herself out of it, she closed the distance between them. Michael didn't hesitate. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, his warmth seeping into her skin. And for the first time in a long time, Aisha let herself be held. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she was letting herself believe in something that would never work. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. She wasn't standing on her own. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to anymore. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. If you enjoyed this one, check out more stories. We have plenty waiting for you. Share this video with friends who love a good story.